Hello, welcome back. Today I want to take a closer look at uh, hydration and electrolytes, specifically how to understand your specific needs for hydration and electrolytes for yourself or for your athlete. So let's dive in here. One of the things we need to know is the effect of dehydration on performance. Um, at around about 1% of weight loss, the sensation of thirst is triggered. At this stage, we need to immediately start drinking because performance loss starts pretty soon after that. If we lose about 2% of our body weight, there's impaired performance, there's decreased mental acuity, and we're not working at our best. As we go from 2% through 3% up to 4% loss in body weight, there is a 30 to 50% decrease in endurance. There are gastrointestinal problems, there are cardiac problems, and there can be heat illness. So we absolutely need to avoid getting into the situation where we have a 4% loss in body weight, and we want to reduce our body weight losses, keep them under 2%, preferably around 1% of body weight. Now, sweat rates differ dramatically from sport to sport. Baseball has some of the lower sweat losses, but even within a sport like baseball, there are some people who are low-level sweaters and some people who are high-level sweaters. If you're a high sweat rate person, you will know it. But going through the sports here, you can see that soccer and basketball have higher increasing sweat loss rates. But endurance, ultra endurance activities, and sports like American football, where the athlete is covered in pads and retaining heat, have some of the highest sweat rate losses. But again, it varies dramatically from athlete to athlete, and it also varies depending on the conditions. One of the ways you can tell whether you are correctly hydrated is from the color of your urine. Sometimes people have in the past said that peeing clear should be your goal. It should not be. You want to be well hydrated, which is about this color here, this color yellow here. We want to avoid the bright yellow colors, and certainly the very dark yellow colors is extremely dehydrated conditions here. But we also want to avoid the very, very light colors too, because that means we're overhydrated. And if we're overhydrated, we may be losing some of those vitamins that we need, vitamin C and B group vitamins, those water-soluble vitamins, we may be urinating those out. So we want to stay well hydrated, but not overhydrated. There are some important factors with regards to hydration. The intensity of your exercise. As intensity increases, hydration, sweat losses increase. Temperature and humidity, also the wind speed will alter your losses, your sweat losses. The amount of clothing you wear definitely affects your sweat losses, and the type of clothing you wear. Your acclimation to heat will affect your sweat losses. Athletes can become acclimated to hot conditions with training, and as your training improves, your sweat losses oddly tend to increase. And obviously there are genetic differences, person-to-person differences in sweat losses. The heat is a very complicated issue. It's not just the air temperature, it's the reflected solar radiation. So if you're running on a hard black tarmac surface, that reflected sunlight is another important factor. The thermal radiation radiating up from the surface when black surfaces maybe absorb heat. There's the amount of wind and convection. There's how well your body is radiating heat away, and in sections where it's covered, it won't radiate heat away as well. There's how hard you're working, of course, from the muscle contraction. There's the blood flow. Some people have better blood flow to their extremities and can lose increased sweat loss that way. And some people can cool off by having more blood flow to the skin surface, so they don't need to sweat quite as hard. All of these factors mean it's very, very difficult to guess how much an athlete is going to sweat at a particular temperature. So this is something you need to measure. Here are some examples of sweat losses at different temperatures. So you can't just measure the athlete's sweat losses at one temperature. You really need to understand the sweat losses at the temperature that the athlete will be working out. So, for example, if it's 55 Fahrenheit, you might be losing 0.8 of a liter per hour. But as that temperature rises up to 35 degrees, you can see that the same athlete can be losing 3 liters of liquid. That's when you're controlling the effort level. So even at one controlled effort level. So it's a very complex problem. So what do you need to do to measure your sweat rate? Well, first of all, you need to know what conditions you're going to be working out in. You will need a scale to be able to measure. You need that accurate to at least 0.1 of a kilogram, or less than a pound. 0.1 of a pound. It would be good to have a kitchen scale so you can weigh water bottles. Maybe towels to dry off after your exercise, and you'll need a calculator. So the first thing to do is weigh yourself before you start your exercise. You need to know your weight before you start your exercise, and then after you towel off after your exercise. This will be your weight loss. When you know your weight loss and the duration of your exercise, you're most of the way there. But you also need to know how much fluid you consumed during that exercise. You need the weight of the bottle before, the weight of the bottle after. This is how much volume you've consumed. And if you've urinated, you need to know what your urine loss is. You'd have to measure that as well. So your sweat rate in liters per hour is your weight loss plus the volume that you've consumed, because you've taken on a little bit of extra liquid, minus any urine loss, and divided by the duration in hours. That will give you the number of liters per hour. So long as you're measuring in kilograms before and kilograms after. If you're measuring in pounds, you'll have to convert those to kilograms so you can find your sweat rate in liters per hour. Along with your sweat rate, you'll be losing electrolytes, you'll be losing sodium, and you'll be losing potassium. Now, there are several ways of measuring that. You can do a whole body washdown. This is very unpractical. Nobody really does this except for sports scientists. There are sweat patches that can collect sweat locally, and those can be removed and analyzed. There are biometric sensors, but they're of questionable accuracy. And there are sensors that can be tested using pharmacological agents to drive sweat losses. I've used a Gatorade patch, which is something that you might want to try if you're particularly concerned about salt loss. Typically what I do is I place athletes into one of 3 categories: low salt loss, medium salt loss, and high salt loss. If you finish your daily sport exercise at the temperature that you usually work out in, covered in salt crystals, that means you're a high salt loss person. If you're a medium salt loss person, you're sweating around about the same as everybody else. And if you're a low sweat loss, sodium loss person, you'll know that you just don't sweat as much as everybody else. So those are 3 categories that you can just basically guesstimate where people lie. Okay, so how do you know whether you need additional sodium? So you can ask yourself a number of questions. First of all, is the athlete working out for less than 4 hours or more than 4 hours? If they're working out for more than 4 hours in a day, absolutely they need to add additional sodium to their diet. If not, just seasoning to taste is probably fine. If your hourly sweat rate is high, let's say you're losing more than 1.8 liters per hour, and you've measured this using your scale, if you're losing more sweat than 1.8 liters per hour, you're absolutely a high sweat loss person, a high sodium loss person, and you definitely need to add sodium to your diet. If during your workouts, and you should be doing this during any workouts up to 4 hours, you are replacing greater than 70% of your fluids with an electrolyte, with a sports drink, that's what you should be doing. If that's the case, you don't need extra electrolytes. However, if you're not doing that and you're getting dehydrated during the workouts, then you absolutely need electrolytes after your workout, and you need to replace some of that sodium. And finally, if you are a high sweat loss person, that means you're losing greater than 1 gram of sodium per hour. That means you're covered in white crystalline salt at the end of your workout, at the end of your exercise. If you're this high sweat loss person, then absolutely you should start thinking about replacing your sodium losses with around about 50% of your losses. So if you're losing 1 gram of sodium per hour, you want to be thinking about adding an additional 500 milligrams of sodium to your diet for every hour of sodium sweat loss. One thing to note is if you're covered in tattoos, this will lower your sweat rate, but it will increase your sodium losses in the areas that do sweat. So tattoos may compromise sweating. It's not related to the age of the tattoo, but it will mean that you'll have higher salt loss in the remaining areas. So what are some pieces of advice here? As far as hydration go, usually a person that's an average sweat loss will be losing somewhere in the range of 0.4 to 0.8 liters per hour. Usually this is sufficient hydration. You should test to see if your needs are higher or lower than this. Drinking to thirst may be insufficient, so you'll have to see how you do with just following drinking to thirst. Maybe try that in a workout sometime. If you drink to thirst and you find that you're losing weight, you may need to increase your hydration. Typically, sodium of about 500 to 700 milligrams per liter is fine, unless you're one of those people that has ended up covered in salt at the end of their workout. Sometimes they'll need to exceed this 700 milligrams of sodium per hour, but it's pretty rare to find athletes like that, although they do occur. And if you're a very low sweat loss person, you want to be shooting for the low end. High sweat loss person or moderate sweat loss person is aiming for the higher end of this range. And potassium should be in that 100 to 200 milligrams per liter. It is not necessary to have more potassium than this. Now, individual variability does make defining the ideal fluid composition for electrolytes in your drink very, very difficult. But my recommendation would be that you would start out with 0.8 liters, around 700 milligrams, 600 to 700 milligrams of sodium, and 100 to 200 milligrams of potassium in the drink of your choice. That would be an excellent starting point, and then adjust from there, either up if you're sweating more, or down if you're sweating less. Let's bust a myth. And again, another myth to bust. A lot of people talk about coconut water. Oh, coconut water is the best hydration fluid. Coconut water is has an interesting composition. It has, compared to a sports drink, which usually contains about 400 milligrams of sodium, coconut water contains about 280 milligrams of sodium, so it's lower for sodium. In terms of potassium, this is where the big difference occurs. Potassium in sports drinks are typically about 120, that's in that 100 to 200 milligram range that we were talking about, whereas coconut water is often as high as 2,000 milligrams. That's a really high number, and that is way more than athletes need. The carbohydrate concentration in your sports drink is 60 to 70 grams, which is ideal for 1 to 2 hours of working out. And whereas in coconut water, the carbohydrate concentration is really too low. So your kilocalories are going to be higher in sports drink and lower in coconut water. Okay, so very high potassium levels in coconut water, not needed. Very low sodium, again, too low for your athlete. Low carbohydrate, again, too low. So let's bust that myth. Coconut water is not the best rehydration fluid or fluid to take during your workouts. Sports drinks typically are a better choice, but if you're a moderate to high sweat person, you may need to go for a sports drink with higher levels of sodium than this, or you may need to add a little bit of extra sodium to your diet.